And welcome back to another tactical analysis. Today it is on Manchester City 1, Manchester United 1 in the Community Shield. Manchester City won 7-6 on penalties, and it was an interesting tactical battle from both teams. It's hard to get a real reading of where this actually sits with where they are as teams, because the Community Shield isn't the most taken seriously of competitions. It's you could argue the most important of the non-important things in football. Underlined by the fact that City have lost it the last three times but gone on to win the league in all three of those times. So take that for what you will. As you can see by the teams out, it's a mixture of first teamers and rotation squad players plus young players due to players coming back late from international tournaments. Injuries picked up in pre-season, so these aren't their two first 11s. They're not far off, but they're not the complete first 11s. When City would build up, it was a kind of different shape to what we've seen, and I actually really enjoyed it for the most part. I thought it was interesting, and it offered the three at the back, but it also still created a good amount of width. So Gvardiol and Akanji were the wide centre-backs. Kovacic was the sole pivot that would drop in to receive the ball from the defenders to progress play. Mason Mount did a man-marking job on him, and he was stuck to him really well. McAtee would go in between the half space and the wide areas to receive the ball. Moving into this position gave him a bit more space that he could receive the ball. Sometimes you'd see Doku out there as well, pulling in a little bit deeper, and McAtee would involve himself into the half space. Either or, they took their time. O'Reilly is the midfielder in between the two wide players. Rico Lewis would stay out wide in the original phase, but he would slowly come infield with Oscar Bob maintaining the width in these areas. So it would float in between a 3-1-3-3 and a 3-1-5-1, I guess you can say. And where this pulled apart United's shape was the front two, and Mount and Fernandes were pretty clear. Mount was tasked with man marking Kovacic, wasn't allowing him to get any real time and space on the ball to play through, as if he was actually Rodri playing that role. And when he passed back, that would be the trigger for Bruno Fernandes to go and press the player on the ball. Diaz would then naturally resort to going back to Ederson, who would go long, unsuccessfully a number of times, or he'd play it to either Gvardiol or Akanji. Now, Ahmad had a pretty clear role on this right-hand side. He was tasked with pressing it to Gvardiol in this area here. Gvardiol being the left-back that tucked in, he was pretty static. Rashford didn't have that same amount of joy, where Ahmad had a pretty stationary target to mark. I think the role for Rashford would have also been to take care of Rico Lewis, the right-back. But because of Rico Lewis's position, the fact that he did push up high, he didn't just invert alongside Kovacic to allow Rashford to maintain a more narrow presence with the two forwards in Mount Fernandes and Ahmad in this area. Lewis would push really high up into this attacking area in the half space, and as a result, Rashford got caught in between Akanji and Rico Lewis all game, and that then became the free man front, and that became where their build-up started from, really. So Akanji would receive the ball here, goes up to press Akanji, but then Rico Lewis becomes a bit free because O'Reilly and McAtee would occupy Casemiro and Mainu. They would be following them. So this pass would then become free. And Martinez was faced with a 2-on-1 situation at left back. Does he come to Lewis and risk Bob going free? Or does he stand off and allow Bob to pin him back? And what he did was he stood off and allowed Bob to pin him back. And the reason for that is because he couldn't risk this ball going into this area here against Johnny Evans. He couldn't risk Johnny Evans being isolated behind him. So naturally, he would stay deep and protect that space with his life. He didn't overcommit at all. So when the players would receive the ball in the wide areas for City, they had a bit of cushion and the press was reactive. It wasn't proactive. They weren't pressing up in this area when Akanji was on the ball. And Lewis and Bob had fantastic games. They really attacked that right flank well. Martinez couldn't deal with defending Oscar Bob in the wide areas. The quick turn of pace did him on a number of occasions, especially for the City equalising goal late on. And it just really showed that Martinez has a lack of mobility that maybe wouldn't serve him playing left back. Or if Rashford did drop in and man marked Rico Lewis in this area, with Mainu and Casemiro in this area, you'd have one of two things: either Doku pulling out to this left back area with McAtee occupying this area, or you'd have McAtee pulling across for Doku to come into this area, and they would fire the ball into this area, which was a bit hit and miss. The passing from these areas was erratic from Ruben Diaz, from Ederson, and Manuel Akanji, so it very rarely hit its target. McAtee did a really good job in this position. I feel like he showed his technical quality throughout the attacking areas of the pitch. But where they did get a bit of joy was Jeremy Doku. And again, Dalot was deep wasn't overly committing to the press because he didn't want to risk isolating Maguire down that side, which did happen against Doku once, where Doku beat Dalot one-on-one and then beat Maguire in this area in the side of the box. So Dalot wouldn't commit, same as if McAtee got the ball, Doku would make sure he was pinned back. And one-on-one, Doku had his threats against Dalot, beat him in the majority of the times they faced. He just didn't have the end quality to really create anything from this area, though, which hurt City. So there was a lot of penetration, just a real lack of quality once they got into forward areas. In the second half, though, when City would build up a bit deeper, when it would be in their sort of 4-2-4 shape, if I just move that round now, saying United were pressing a lot higher on this side. They try and squeeze City over to a side of the pitch. So let's say if Ederson played that ball to Akanji, Bruno Fernandes would shadow the marker, pressing into him. Rashford and Mount and Mainoo would back him up. Johnny Evans would also follow suit, and he'd start joining in the press from a more aggressive sense, pushing up into Oscar Bob if he dropped into this area to try and receive the ball. They were a lot more proactive. They were winning the ball back higher, and City's build-up shape got a bit ruined. And City did drop off second half a lot. And as a result, they would frequently go long into this area up against Erling Haaland, who wasted a few counter-attacks with his poor dribbling ability, it has to be said. He did really struggle in transition. And they brought on Bernardo Silva in the second half, and with the changes that Manchester United made, Bernardo Silva was able to find his movement at the back post against out-of-position Facundo Pellistri. Oscar Bob beating Lisandro Martinez down that side, as I was just saying, really struggling in the wide areas against him with a quick turn of pace. And as a result, City were able to force the penalties, which then resulted in them winning the Community Shield. But tactically, really good from Manchester City. They used United's shape against them. United did well to adapt and be more progressive. As a result, that came with risk, which cost them. But an interesting battle either way. Now we're going to go on to United in possession. Man United's build-up shape confuses me. I don't get it. I've never truly liked it from Ten Hag. First off, it really didn't work against City. They build up narrow, which if you've watched my channel before, you know I'm not a fan of. But it would involve Haaland pressing Onana if he was on the ball. And basically the game is that the player centrally, who's the sole pivot of the ball, looks for the pass that he can then play out wide to the centre-back who can bring the ball forward and create from there. The issue is that most teams, when they're in their defensive shape, protect the middle with their life and they'll press the wide areas. It's a pretty simple defensive tactic across football. So Martinez was typically the player that would push in centrally. His lane was blocked off as Haaland would go to press the player on the ball, whether that be Onana or the wide centre-back, and McAtee would cover in Martinez. You'd get them rotating. Sometimes it would be McAtee that would press the player on the ball and Haaland dropping in. And as a result then, Doku would push around into Maguire, Oscar Bob would push around to Evans, and they would typically look to build up on this left-hand side and get players on the ball here. Casemiro was pushed up a little bit further than Mainoo. Reactively, you'd get Mainoo dropping into this position here. O'Reilly would track in and prevent him from getting on the ball. And even reactively, you'd see him. You'd see sometimes Bruno Fernandes coming out into the left-back position to receive the ball. But then Rico Lewis would jump to press in this area. And why that was okay to leave Rashford isolated in this position is Manuel Akanji in this position is one of the best centre-backs in the world. In a high-line situation against a fast-paced player on the right-hand side, he's got the athleticism to keep up with them. So he is the perfect profile to play that right centre-back position, allowing Rico Lewis to go and press the player that would pull wide. But it was never a system, really. It felt like for players to come into this position. It was only reactive, and because Bruno Fernandes was given a bit of a free role. Kobbie Mainoo had a few chances to play out and break out and use his press resistance to create for United, but it didn't happen often enough. And typically, if the ball would come to Martinez and he'd lay it off to Maguire, he would then carry the ball forward, which would mean Martinez would move back into the defensive areas. Maguire would pull forward, and then maybe he couldn't create from this position, so he'd have to go back. He'd be playing as the sole pivot, and it would recycle again. You get Evans coming into this position as well, so the three would rotate. Which, for me, this tactic is crazy because generally centre-backs aren't good with their back to play. They're just not. It's not a skill set they need. It's not a skill set they get coached. And there's very few that could pull it off. Neither of these can. Even Martinez, who's technically unbelievable, struggles with playing with his back to play. His position is in this left centre-back, left-back position where he can thread balls through, as he did when he moved more centrally in the second half. And so as a result, City were easily able to press them. Casemiro wasn't getting involved in the shorter build-up. Mainoo was struggling to get on the ball. Dalot was a non-factor in the original stages of build-up. He was caught sort of high up. And as a result, the 1+ rule that you're supposed to have when building out United did not even come close to executing. They would create chances from this position, and that was due to the movement of Bruno Fernandes and Mason Mount pulling into areas, as I was speaking about before, to create chances, getting on the ball here, finding space in behind the Manchester City midfield or to the side of it to then play the ball to Mason Mount, who would drop in, who would then look to set Marcus Rashford and Amad Diallo on their way. And they did get a bit of joy, specifically down the right-hand side, with Amad Diallo faced up against Gvardiol with this tactic. And the movement they had and the runners they had, and once they pushed Manchester City back, which I'll do now, is United would bomb forward with the midfield five, essentially, if you include Dallo in there. Casemiro would do a fantastic job of driving the ball from deep. He basically played as a box-to-box midfielder in this game as opposed to a six. His passing and movement to the likes of Bruno Fernandes to carry on his run and link up one touch. When they got into these more attacking areas, they were a lot better than they were in the original build-up because they were committing numbers forward and City weren't making them pay on transition. And United's downfall was their lack of attacking quality in these areas, and they really failed to put City to bed. But they did make changes second half, and I'll just go over them now. So as you can see, United made a whole host of changes, and the real big change was that they split their centre backs in the second half a lot wider. They were playing a lot more with a wide build up. Onana was having a little bit more time on the ball to create chances, and while this left them isolated in the original build up phase, the City's press dropped off dramatically second half. Didn't find their rhythm and were just a bit lackluster. And as a result, Onana had a bit more time on the ball. The centre backs had a bit more time, and because of the wideness and because of how much they were splitting the City wide players with this build up, they could fire more passes into these players they had in the more attacking areas. Dallo, who was playing the single pivot, Fernandes, McTominay, Casemiro, and Collier all had the beating of the midfield two in Kovacic and O'Reilly. Diaz and Akanji weren't as willing to go and press Fernandes and McTominay because of the runs that Rashford and then later Sancho and Garnacho could hit into these areas. Although there was a few times where Palestri's positioning especially did attract Gvardiol, and this is where United's goal came from, was Gvardiol getting caught up the pitch ball watching, which allowed Garnacho to operate in this space between him and Ruben Diaz as Rico Lewis was pushed a little bit further on and find the space in this area here. Beat Ruben Diaz one-on-one to cut inside onto his weaker foot and score. Gvardiol getting suckered in too easily. City made easier for him because their pressure dropped off dramatically, just showing the signs that it's a pre-season game. But fair play. United, I would say, were the better team as on the complexion of the game with the chances they created. Rashford should have scored, McTominay should have scored, and you're looking at a different game. They make their changes later on with Palestri, as I was saying, getting caught at the far post, a winger playing fullback, not reading the run of the experienced Bernardo Silva well, and that can happen. And then it's a lottery on penalty shootout with Johnny Evans thinking he's prime Pirlo. But there we go, the curtain raiser of the season. It's going to be a fun one ahead of us. Cheers for watching, lads. In a bit.